Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. Welcome. So, today I want to talk to you about a very interesting topic. I want to talk to you about magic damage. Magic damage is a specific element in Diablo 2 that is separate from all the other elements. Obviously, we have access to fire damage, lightning damage, cold damage, poison damage, and we also have magic damage. But what makes magic damage special is also something that makes magic damage worse. The primary strength of magic damage is that it allows you to bypass most elemental resistances in the game. In fact, the majority of monsters in the game tend to be sitting at around 0% resistance. So when you fight a monster with magic damage, if you have, say, like 5,000 magic damage, or in my case, I have some magic damage right now, so I have 2,881 to 3,098. So for the majority of the time, I can do that damage directly to the target. So 3,098 is exactly how much I get because the monsters generally have 0% resistance. There are two main issues with this. And this comes down to, well, number one, there is no way to reduce magic resistance, and in any significant amount. I believe you can, if a monster is immune to magic resistance, you can bring them down by 5% with the black cleft, bringing them from 100% immune to 95% immune, which essentially doesn't really do you very much good at all. So there's effectively no way to reduce magic resistance, and this is an issue, especially when you come across monsters that have extremely high magic resistance. For instance, if you take a look at monsters like Uber Mephisto, Uber Mephisto actually has a relatively large amount of magic resistance, which means that whenever you fight Uber Mephisto, you'll see here that he has 75 magic resistance. And this means that, well, your magic spells do basically nothing. And there's no way that you can stop this from happening. So, because there's no effective way of reducing magic resistance, well, you basically just get your resistance or damage actually stunted. Now, this isn't a huge problem because, with the exception of a lot of the Uber bosses like Uber Diablo, Uber Mephisto, Uber Baal, Pandemonium Diablo, Uber Iswal, Uber Lilith, or rather regular Lilith, and Uber Duriel, there's not a lot of monsters in the game that have magic resistances. There's a couple zombies in Act 2. There's the Act 2 wave of Baal, and it's a handful of monsters at best, right? So, for the most part, at the very least, you feel pretty safe and secure in that most of the monsters, I'd say at least 95% of the monsters in the game, generally have about 0% resistance. And so, even though some monsters are very magic immune, essentially, or magic resistant, and they bring your magic damage relatively low, you're safe and secure in the fact that, well, at least I can do a massive amount of damage to the monsters that aren't magic resistant. Well, here's where things get even more tricky. So, a spell that does magic damage only, like for instance, your 3,000 damage on your Bone Spirit, which that's not even as high as you can get. You can get much higher than that. You can deal 3,000 damage, right? Or you can deal however much damage that you can do per shot with your magic ability. The problem is that because you can't reduce the resistance any further below zero, we're in the same exact boat. So if I'm say, a fire sorceress or something, or if I'm a cold sorceress, or a lightning sorceress, or if I'm a paladin using vengeance, or any other number of things, any element in the game, fire, lightning, ice, and even poison, can all go down as low as negative 100% resistance on a monster. This effectively means that you can increase your damage past a certain point. So, this is something that magic damage cannot do. Magic damage can never lower resistance below zero, and it can also not lower the resistance of a monster that is immune. So, in the case of fire, lightning, and ice, magic only beats fire, ice, lightning, and ice when you do not have any form of negative resistance. And this, of course, even includes physical. We could include physical in here as well. because physical can also be reduced to negative 100%, right? So in this particular case, when you're talking about the elements, they can go down to negative 100%, and this means that they effectively get times 2 to their total damage output if you can bring a monster down to negative 100, which is possible in a lot of situations. Like you can use a barbarian with dual crescent moons and load up on lightning charms like my Thor barbarian, or you can run, like double phoenixes and all sorts of other things. You can run Conviction, which brings a monster down by negative 150%. You can do lower resistance. You can add in Conviction and lower resistance. There is a myriad of ways that you can reduce the resistance of a monster, including cold resistance, which, and Sorceress has Cold Mastery that can reduce a monster down to negative 100 like that. Now, because you can reduce a monster down to negative 100, and because you can essentially multiply your damage, this means that the other elements, fire, lightning, ice, poison, and physical, have more damage than magic will ever hope to have, simply because they can always multiply their damage by decreasing the resistance of the monster. And this is especially the case when you're fighting something like Uber Mephisto. With Uber Mephisto, you can see that he has 75 magic, 75 fire, 75 cold, right? So in this case, like, it's not necessarily the biggest deal. You would think, like, oh, well, he has 75 resistance to everything. However, if I was running Conviction or lower resistance, or if I have a large amount of negative enemy resistance on my character, I can effectively squash that 75% resistance to fire, cold, lightning, whatever it is that he potentially has resistances to, and I can, of course, bring him into the negative, which is something that you cannot do with magic damage. So the interesting thing about magic damage is that the strength of magic damage is in that most monsters are not immune to it. However, the weakness of magic damage is also in that most monsters are not immune to it because they set magic damage up with no forms of reduction. They set magic damage up so that it would get penalized heavily on the very difficult bosses in the game, like Uber Mephisto and Uber Diablo and so forth and so on. And then on top of that, they also made it so that the other elements could be reduced lower than the 0% resistance magic damage does. To give you like an effective demonstration of this, all you really have to do is go to a character that does something other than physical damage. Like, for instance, I could take a look at my trader here, and we could bring him into a game just for the moment. And we can look at his elemental damage and then think about all his negative resistance. So he currently has 13,000 on the top end for his elemental damage. So 13,000 damage. However, you divide that by 4, and you're going to get 3,250 per element, including physical. So he's doing essentially a quarter of that damage is going to be a separate element. However, he does also carry with him Conviction, which brings monsters down by negative 150%, which means that most of this damage is going to be multiplied by that negative amount, which means that instead of 13,000, of course, depending on the monster. But instead of 13,000, you are going to get a much larger bonus because even if the monster has 50% resistance, you're going to be able to bring them down to 50, down to 0, and then another 100 brings them down to negative 100. So you might as well just simply multiply that by 2. Which means that my boy's doing 26,000 damage a hit, not 13,000 damage a hit. And this has to do with the fact that negative resistance is going to enhance fire, lightning, cold, poison, and even physical if you use amplify damage and decrepify by a rather large margin. But it's not something that magic damage can do, and it never has been something that magic damage could do. So while magic damage is very impressive in certain situations, like, for instance, using your Hammerden or your Bone Spear Necromancer, or maybe even your Fist of the Heavens Paladin. The real truth of the matter is that characters that are built around a specific element, stacking a specific negative resistance, can often outdamage magic damage by a large degree because they are multiplying their damage by the negative resistance number that they're able to get the monster to. And this is why characters like my Thor Barbarian work so well, because they function by stacking large amounts of negative res, large amounts of elemental damage, and then multiplying that elemental damage on the monster, essentially removing all problems of killing them. I've made tons of characters over the years, and this one right here, the Bowmancer, is probably one of the weirdest. It's actually a bone spear firing necromancer, and it kind of solves some of the problems of only having elemental damage, or rather magic damage, by giving you other damage as well, like physical, as well as a little bit of fire added in and some other fun stuff. But this is definitely an example of a magic damage character. And how this character works is essentially you fire the bow procs the bone spears, and then when you hit the targets, you get a rather large amount of damage from shooting a bow, which is really fun. I give you a short demonstration of the character real quick. So every time you hit a target, you fire off a bone spear. And of course, I need my lovely golem to run interference for me. And the bone spears essentially just pierce and go through the targets. The damage that you get is proportional to the number of pierces that you get and the number of bone spears that you fire. So you're doing magic damage, physical damage, a little bit of elemental damage too from the explosions. And overall, it tends to work fairly well. But the damage output on this is still magic damage, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video, just simply to explain the difference of how magic damage's strength, its main strength, the ability to basically bypass most monsters' resistances, is also one of its main weaknesses because it can never reduce the resistance below 0%. Now, there were some cases, and before somebody says this, because I know somebody's going to be like, I'm a ginger. There used to be ways to reduce magic resistance in long, long lost patches. Lower resist, the actual curse lower resistance, used to be able to reduce magic resistance in one of the earlier patches, and it was removed from lower resistance. That was, I think, back in like 1.0. Was it 6 or something like that? It was 1.04 or 1.05. I can't remember. It was really early on. That lower resistance could reduce magic resistance, and it was taken away from lower resistance as well. There are some mods to the game that allow you to reduce lower resistance, but what the hell does that even matter? For the most part, when it comes to magic damage, the main strength of it is also its weakness, and it's something interesting to consider if you're trying to make a magic damage character. And also to understand that, well, monsters like Uber Mephisto and Uber Diablo and Pandemonium Bale and whatnot are basically kind of out of your reach. Because even if you do a relatively large amount of damage, like say you do like 10,000 damage a shot, you're still going to have your damage reduced by 75% whenever you're attacking one of these uber bosses and essentially neutering all damage output that you have. There are also, some monsters that are going to stand in your way, like the magic immune monsters in the Bale Waves, and also some of the Act 2 monsters that are going to be a pain in your butt. And these are not the only monsters in the game that have an innate magic resistance, but there aren't a huge number of them. So I will say that much at least. When it comes to magic damage, it's definitely a fun thing to play around with. One thing I definitely will say is I really wish they would reduce the number of synergies for like Bone Spirit, Bone Spear, Teeth, and open up build options with this particular character, because the number of synergies that you need to max out Bone Spear is kind of ridiculous. It's pretty ridiculous. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys again joining. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.